President Buhari's administration is likely to come up with 8 trillion naira as a budget for 2016. That's a figure never before heard of. That's a lot of money. Okay, so how will this money come into place and who puts the budget together? Now we have a new management team for the president and for the country, as it were. Let's bring in Tilewa Adebajo, who is an economic policy analyst, to talk to us on some of these issues. Good morning.
Good morning, boss.
We appreciate your coming. The biggest news in 2015 since the March 28 presidential election was yesterday's announcement. So we now have the management team. Give us your view on this team.
Well, for me, it's been a very long time coming, and I think it's better late than never, and the team is in place. It's a political economy. It's the president's choice, and I think what's important now for me is the people are in place, and let's get going, because we're already in a recession, and if they're going to do anything at all, then it's this budget that they need to focus on. So the most important thing for me now is for the president to now properly articulate his economic policy and direction. Let's get the medium-term economic framework for this budget sent to the National Assembly, and let's understand the structure of this budget, because we've been hearing all kinds of numbers, as you mentioned, 8 trillion budget. And if you distill the numbers down, there are a lot of numbers don't add up. It's a bit fuzzy at the moment with the math. And it's important that all these ministers begin to sing from the same hymn sheet. We don't want a situation where the GMD for the NNPC came through, gave them 90 days to fix the refineries. If not, they're going to privatize it. The vice president comes and says nothing, refinery is not for privatization. So what is for privatization? The NIPP is there. Are they going to privatize? Are they not going to privatize? So there's a lot of policy issues that we need to harmonize,
put together,
so that they can sing from the same hymn sheet.
The time is also not on our side. On the side of this management team, we have 6 weeks to December 31st.
Yeah.
Will they be able to put a budget together?
Well, the budget also has to be passed by the National Assembly, and they're going to go on recess pretty soon. So they can't pass it until next year.
So the 2016 budget, whatever figure it is, can come into place until 2016. How soon in 2016 do you think we can safely say we have a budget that is workable for the next 12 calendar months?
February at the earliest. Latest probably March, because what happens is the ministers now have to probably go through their ministries. They have to understand what is in those ministries. They now have to harmonize that with the government policies, the government framework. The vice president, as you said, mentioned a figure of about 8 trillion. The question now is, what is going on and how things are going to move. And so in terms of the budgetary process itself, the first thing that needs to happen is for that medium-term economic framework to be sent to the National Assembly. And that hasn't happened yet. So by the time the ministers settle down, get a feel for what is in their ministries, probably some work has been done by the planning ministries to those ministers. They probably have to look at it, and they're going to harmonize those things, understand those numbers, so that the minister can now harmonize his own budget and send it in. Some ministers have now consolidated ministries like transport, like works, housing, power.
National planning.
So all those ministries, their budgets have to be harmonized by somebody who is new. And the person who is new wants to make sure he has a very good understanding of those projects in place, how he's going to prioritize those projects, especially since there's not enough funding for every project. So there's a lot of prioritization that needs to be done. So you can't do that in 6 weeks.
That's talking about the agenda now for them.
Yes.
Because it looks like a new agenda has to be set based on a number of factors. The money's not there. We're clawing back and trying to save some money through anti-corruption, whatever it is. We're managing resources better, yes. But again, we need to plan because things are a little bit different. Yes. You're giving this new set of ministers a number of multiple portfolios to straddle on a daily basis. That's a lot of work. But let's talk about this 8 trillion. Where do you think this money will come from?
Well, before we do that, let's step back a little bit and understand what has happened with this year's budget. The president did not send a supplementary budget to the Congress. So basically, we're still running President Jonathan's, or former President Jonathan's budget that was passed. And if you take a look at the breakdown of that budget was about 3.4 trillion. And out of that 3.4 trillion, you'll find about probably maybe 2 trillion of that went towards salaries and overheads. 1 trillion went to debt service. So you only had about maybe 400 billion left. And they now projected $1 trillion worth of deficit financing to cover that budget of 4 trillion. So if Jonathan's budget was 4 trillion and they're trying to project 8 trillion, then what you find out that if you take a look at the run rate of federal revenue this year, the last money that was collected by the federal government was only 200 million. So it's been very poor. So they're not even going to be able to meet the revenue projections of 3 trillion that they have put in place. So the deficits, which is 1 trillion, can easily go up to 2 trillion.
In the 2016 budget?
Well, I'm talking about the current budget.
Current one.
Okay, so we're talking about the current deficit. So in planning an 8 trillion expansion, then that means you have to borrow. And right now, the current debt profile is about 63.8 billion US dollars. And right now, we're spending 33% of our revenues to service our debt, and that is not sustainable. So if they're going to borrow, the first thing that needs to do is that on the monetary side of that, we need to reduce the base rate from the 13% to about 9% to reduce the cost of borrowing for government. And if you find a situation whereby there's a 100 basis point spread between the base rate and what the commercial banks are lending, that is not only ridiculous, but it's a rip-off and clearly not sustainable for growth in the economy. So
moving forward.
So clearly, moving forward, the rates on the monetary side needs to drop so that the cost of borrowing can reduce to be able to get government to fund more money, the 4 trillion, at probably a cheaper rate. So it's going to be a big stretch.
Do you think the team on ground will be able to tidy up the carryover 2015 budget of the Jonathan's administration and get ready for their own budget? Because you need to tidy up one for the other. Government is a continuum, as you explained that, because right now the DMO is going on his own monthly borrowings as allowed by law and by statute, and all of that. But then you still need to get ready for the next journey, as it were. So we're trying to carry this over into the next one. The time, as I said, is a little bit short. On whose shoulder do you think this should be within the new team that we have in place?
Well, clearly, there's a monetary policy and fiscal policy coordinating committee, which is supposed to be chaired by the DG of the Debt Management Office. And it comprises of various people from various departments. I don't know what their last quarterly meeting, when they met last quarter, if they met. They're supposed to meet quarterly. But clearly, this coordinating committee should have been able to harmonize certain policies and to be able to put a position in place so that the key players in this whole process would be the Minister for Finance, obviously, will have to lead this process. You have also, but I don't even think it's the Minister of Finance anymore. We have a budget and planning. So the budget office has been moved into the planning ministry. That's another adjustment. So the Minister for Budget and Planning would have to drive the budget process now, no longer the Finance Minister.
And that's the Senator Udoma?
Exactly. So he's going to have to lead this process now. Because so
it's his call now.
It's his call
no
now.
Longer,
the budget office has been moved out of finance,
yes.
because you've now created the budget and planning. So the budget office is now out of the finance ministry into the planning ministry. So he's going to take responsibility for trying to deliver that budget. He'll obviously they have to work in coordination with the finance ministry, and all the other ministers now would have to go and harmonize their budgets and see what happens. But the key thing that we're seeing is that we have not met our revenue targets this year. And even the debt funding program from the Debt Management Office, we have to find out exactly where that deficit will end up this year, because it will be more significant than the 1 trillion that was budgeted for.
That was planned for in
Exactly.
2014,
Yeah.
thinking of all things will be equal for 2015.
Exactly, and don't forget that they did not factor in the subsidy payments into this current budget, and that's why they're finding it challenging to pay the marketers, because they're going to have to need a supplementary budget and approval
to fund that.
from the Congress to be able to pay for that, because it's not in this budget.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Okay, finally, how do we go with the 8 trillion? Can you look into that for us quickly?
Well, to be honest with you, it's very fuzzy at the moment. Very, very fuzzy. I've looked at the Ministry of Finance website, and the only thing I can pick out is the fact that the revenue that was looked at 3.4 trillion this year, we're not meeting those revenue targets. There's a massive shortfall. So the trillion deficit is going to probably end up about 2 trillion, maybe even more. So until we find out exactly what that deficit profile would be, it will be very difficult for us to begin to speculate. But say, for instance, you're ending up with a 2 trillion deficit this year, and your revenues probably end up about maybe 2.8 trillion, and you want to do a budget of 8 trillion. So that means that you are going to have to fund not only the existing 2 trillion deficit, but you also have to add maybe another 5 trillion to that. So you're looking at financing at least a 6.5 trillion deficit. So that would be the challenge for the financing to get to the 8 trillion you're talking about for next year's budget. So the DMO has a lot of work on its hand. So that means we're going to have to increase our debt profile from the current 63.8 trillion to a significant number. But again, in order to be able to, because we're already at the limit of 33% is not very good of your revenues. So the cost of borrowing has to come down. So they're going to have to push the monetary policy to cut down the base rate to maybe about 8% to be able to support this volume or quantum of financing.
We shouldn't get to 40%.
40%?
That's overheating.
It will be overheating. I mean, we already 33% is already past the 25% acceptable limit. So in order for us to do that, then we need to reduce the cost of borrowing. So we could bring down the base rate to maybe about 7%. So what government is paying in interest or the debt service cost will now come down significantly to be able to adjust for the 6 to 7 trillion that they want to fund.
That's interesting. I think the real conversation just getting started. Now this is the real business.
Yes.
Yeah, so the euphoria, thank everybody for appointing ministers and all that, yes. But then this is the real business.
Reality now sinks in.
This is reality time.
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming. We
Thank you both.
We'll have you back in the next couple of days because, as I said, the real business is just getting started.